ضيفنا في هذه الحلقة الخاصة هو البروفيسور الأمريكي روي كاساغراندا، أستاذ العلوم السياسية في ولاية تكساس الأمريكية. يحاوره عبد الله الجمعة في لقاء يركز على الحضارة الإسلامية المبكرة وعن أحد أهم رموزها، الصحابي خالد بن الوليد، عن فتوحاته وشخصيته وعبقريته العسكرية. وللحديث بقية في الاثنينية.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. هذه حلقة خاصة من برنامجكم اثنينية الرياض، نستضيف فيها البروفيسور الأمريكي روي كاساغراندا، الأستاذ في كلية مجتمع أوستن بولاية تكساس الأمريكية، والمهتم بالفلسفة السياسية وتاريخ الشرق الأوسط، واللي سبق الكثير مننا متابعته خصوصا في حديثه الشهير عن خالد بن الوليد وتكتيكاته العسكرية. Dr. Roy, pleasure having you tonight with us here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I gather you've been traveling around the region, so we do appreciate that you managed to allocate this couple of hours for us here at الثقافية.
It's my pleasure.
So let me start by saying, well, first of all, you have quite a reputation here, a rather good one, and it stemmed from appreciation of your work and studies on Middle Eastern histories and also warfare, and indeed Khalid bin Walid. And we're going to touch on this during our discussion this evening.
Okay, great.
But let me ask you first, who is Dr. Roy Casagranda?
So I'm a professor of political science, but I don't believe that there are these neat little categories. So I also do, besides political science, I have to dive into history and economics and psychology and philosophy, because I feel like you have to know a little bit of everything to be able to have an intelligent conversation about politics.
I see. But when you look at in Western intellectuals, they tend to neglect Islamic civilization when they look into history and the study of history. Like for yourself, like what did started, or what was your motivation into studying Islamic history and civilization?
So for me, as a child, I was always interested in history. I traveled a lot, and so that might have been part of my motivation. I come from a mixed household. My father is European, my mother is Egyptian, and I grew up, a multi-language household as well. And so I was always really fascinated by the Greeks and the Romans and Egyptian history. And as I kept learning, and then a lot of contemporary things like World War II, the American Civil War, U.S. history also. And as I kept learning, I started to notice that there was a gap. There was a 900-year gap, in fact, in my knowledge, from basically the year 600 to 1492. And I couldn't explain the gap. I couldn't see why there was this missing hole. And I think I was 19. I went to the library, and I found a book by Sir John Bagot Glubb Basha. Oh. And it was on Arab history, and I grabbed it and I began reading. And what unfolded in front of me just absolutely amazed me, because it wasn't that there was a missing story, it was a missing story that made everything else make sense. There was this, the Dark Ages. What do you mean the Dark Ages? And it turns out that, yeah, maybe Europe was having a bad time, but the rest of the world was thriving and taking off. And at that point, it forced me to re-examine really everything, because I had to plug that piece in. And I discovered that I had been misinformed about Roman history. I discovered I'd been misinformed about British history, American history. And it forced me to reevaluate everything.
Interesting, because what you're saying now is actually exactly what you said before, like in previous occasions, that Islamic civilization influence in Western civilization has been neglected. It is. For Islamophobic reasons, more or less. Yeah. And you actually mentioned there an interesting example of community property law in Texas that's been, came from Mexico, that's been conquered by the Spanish, in turn who've been ruled by the Arabs in a certain time of history. And do you think it has been neglected in purpose, or just a matter of ignorance?
I mean, it's probably a little bit of both. There are things that I have to, when I'm teaching a political science class, that I have to uneducate my students because they were taught the wrong thing. So there's always a little bit of the ignorance involved. But at the end of the day, I think there was a deliberate agenda to delete Arab history. At some level, Arab history came at the expense of Roman history. When the Arab Empire was formed, a lot of the real estate that was Roman became Arab. And then, of course, the Ottoman Empire finishes the Roman Empire off. And I think there's this sense of intense rivalry that maybe became unhealthy at some point. I'll give you an example. There's the term Byzantine Empire. And anybody who's watched my YouTube channel knows this drives me nuts. There was never a place called the Byzantine Empire. It was the Roman Empire. And in fact, it was the last 1,000 years of the Roman Empire. There was a German historian named Hieronymus Wolff who didn't want the Ottoman Empire to have been the empire that destroyed the Roman Empire on May 29, 1453. So he pretended that the Roman Empire ended on September 4, 476 AD, and then renamed almost 1,000 years of Roman history as Byzantine. But for what purpose? And the purpose was to sort of delete the role of the Ottoman Empire and finishing Rome off. And I think that's kind of been the theme. Delete, ignore, pretend it wasn't there, steal credit for things. And it harms everybody's understanding, because as a result, white people have this sense, especially in the United States, that they invented everything. And it's wrong. We're interconnected. It's not a competition. Each civilization adds and contributes to the next piece, and we're all part of the same civilization at this point, because the Western civilization is in China now. Like, it's everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. You also said, like, the Islamic civilization, when it started and thrived, it had within it the Western civilization, especially
Absolutely.
when it comes to Abrahamic traditions that passed through Christianity to Islam.
Yes.
And as you said, we're interconnected eventually.
But even the language, like the word fulus comes from the Roman word folus, which was a denomination, a coin denomination. And then, of course, you can find Arabic words in English. Everything is wrapped together. There's no separating it.
So let's go back a little bit in history. Like, when you see like the Arab conquest of North Africa, part of Asia and Europe, wouldn't see at the time it's like sort of clash of civilization between Muslims coming to conquer Africa or Europe, in a sense?
No, I don't really think so. And the reason is because, first of all, this idea that there's an East-West is a little... It's overly simplistic. There are multiple civilizations, not two civilizations, right? What is the connection between India and China? It's no stronger than the connection between India and Germany. And so to see it as a binary is automatically wrong. In addition to that, the Arab world at the time, the Arabian Peninsula, was a trade route between India and China and Europe. So it was influenced by both of those things. I think what happened to create this kind of idea of East-West was the Roman-Persian conflict. The Romans saw the Persians as other. And as a result, they wanted to frame it that way, to simplify it, to make it make more sense for their own people. And in the process, they could villainize the other and say, oh, those Persians, they keep fighting us. When the Arabs break onto the scene, it's really a third actor, because at that point, there were these two global superpowers, and then this third power shows up seemingly out of nowhere. Right? There was no indication that anything like this could happen, let alone that it would happen. And the next thing you know, the Arabs have completely conquered the Persian Empire, and they've conquered the majority of the Roman Empire, and they go all the way to Spain. And so, everything from the Indus River to the Straits of Gibraltar suddenly become this largest ever empire to that date. There have been empires bigger since, but at that moment, that was it. And I think it was a little bit of a surprise, a little bit of a shock. But to give you an idea of how intermingled it was, 60% of the Christian population lived in that Arab empire. There were more Christians living in the Arab empire than the entire rest of the planet combined. And there was nothing contradictory about that. The Muslim conquerors didn't force people to convert. They left the population alone and said, you're free to practice your religion, and we're going to respect you because you're people of the book. Just doing that made it so that it wasn't a clash of civilization. But from Europe's perspective, they saw it as the destruction of the Roman Empire. They saw it as lost territory that belonged to them. And so for them, I think they framed it as, who is this other? It's not the Persians anymore, it's the Arabs. And it became easy to just sort of villainize the other.
You mentioned earlier the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. Let's go back to the 7th century when the Arabs rose during the dawn of Islam.
Yeah.
And they started conquer, and actually did conquer the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire in relatively very short time. And that happened simultaneously, like very quickly.
Very quickly.
Extraordinary achievement.
Yes.
How did that happen?
So part of my answer is, I can't explain it.
That's a good way of putting it.
I mean, because some of it doesn't, you look at the numbers, you look at the facts, and you can't make it make sense. And then some of it, you go, okay, well, maybe it was a little bit of this. So for example, Khalid ibn al-Walid plays a major role in this happening. If it hadn't been for him and the way he conducts warfare, first in Iraq and then in Syria and Palestine, it's hard to imagine that this would have been doable. In part because you have to remember that the Persians and the Romans aren't just superpowers, they're superpowers that had been there in some way, shape, or form for 9 or 12 centuries. The Persians were on their 4th empire, but it was 12 centuries of empire. The Romans had officially been an empire for 6 centuries, but the last 3 centuries of the Republic, they were already imperial and conquering other places. So, combined, there was 21 empires, 21 centuries between the 2 empires. And so a person just couldn't comprehend that wasn't going to be permanent, that wasn't the future. When Khalid begins his campaign in Iraq, which, by the way, it's shocking because it's immediate. So the first Khalifa, Abu Bakr, does the Ridda Wars, and in that moment he conquers the Arabian Peninsula. That is the first time in human history that the Arabian Peninsula was ruled by a single state. The Persians had conquered a piece in the east, the Romans had conquered a piece in the northwest. At one point, Ethiopia had invaded Yemen, but it had never been ruled by a single political entity. Well, Abu Bakr had done that within just a few months. By December of 632, it's essentially done. And the next thing you know, Khalid ibn al-Walid is sending a letter to the Persian general in the Basra region of Iraq saying it's time to consider conversion or paying taxes. And just, that's such an insane, bold, unbelievable move against this superpower. And he goes and he fights and he begins this engagement where he wins battle after battle after battle. And the tactics he uses, the strategy he uses, the way he's looking at the situation, make it so that he can conquer the western piece of the Persian Empire, turn around and then go invade Syria, and then he basically conquers Palestine and Syria. And had there not been that moment, that kind of conquest, it's hard for me to imagine that the Arabs could have continued. That there needed to be some sort of initial sort of bridgehead where a piece of land came off of the Roman and Persian empires. But that's the other part of this that's amazing. How do you attack the 2 global superpowers at the same time? Pick one. Pick the weak one, finish it off, then go after the other one. But that's not what happened. Both at the same time. And so it's hard to understand how that's doable. There are factors you can look at. So for example, malaria had become a problem in the Mediterranean, so the population of the Roman Empire had gone down. The Romans and the Persians had just finished a war that had lasted 26 years, so they were worn out a little bit. There are pieces that contribute to it, but it's still unimaginable. It's still too big. And then, by 711, the Arabs have invaded Spain and conquered Spain. They've reached the Indus River, they're in Central Asia, and all of a sudden there's this brand new state. And it's so new, they didn't know how to make the currency. So they were just taking Roman and Persian mints and they were modifying them and minting their own coin, which is why the word fulus comes from the Roman word. They were literally taking the Roman folus and minting it. And so if you find coins from that time period, it'll show you like a Roman emperor. It's usually Heraclius and his two sons, although sometimes it also has one of his sons and his wife, and they're holding up crosses. And so, here are these three Christians holding up crosses, and they'll have a cross on their crown, or there'll be a cross somewhere else, and everything is written in Latin, and then you might see like an Arabic word that they minted over the top of this to create the first Arab coins. And I think at that moment, nobody thought that was weird or strange or bizarre, because why not? And then as time goes by, we'll come back to Khalid, but I just wanted to sort of point this out one step further. The Turks that were living in Anatolia and what becomes Turkey, they called themselves the Sultanate of Rome, as in Rome, as in they saw themselves as the heirs to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire's flag was an eagle with two heads. That became their flag. They didn't see a contradiction. The city of Constantinople, its flag, was a crescent moon and a star.
I see. But the Muslim Turks, you mean?
Yeah.
They pictured like Asia Minor.
Yeah. As they took over Asia Minor, they didn't see this as they're trying to replace the Roman Empire. They saw themselves as the extension of the Roman Empire. They saw themselves as creating a Muslim version of the Roman Empire, but they didn't imagine they were extinguishing it. It's why it became so important to capture Constantinople, because in their minds, they weren't ending a thing, they were just transforming it.
Like continuing.
They were continuing
the civilization.
Exactly.
So let's go back now to Khalid.
Okay,
it's
back
very
to Khalid.
interesting. Like like a lot of your studies and YouTube videos, caught a lot of attention here in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere.
Yes.
How is that relevant to in our modern world? Like we see Commander from the 7th century. Like a lot of historians regarded him one of the greatest commanders of all time. How studying him is relevant to our world today? Especially did you give a lecture about him at the Ministry of Defense here in Saudi Arabia recently?
So that's also a complicated, fun question. So at one level, combat is so different that, he may not be applicable anymore, the lessons that you learn. Every battle he did, he used different tactics. In my imagination, because it's just my interpretation, it looks to me like he sees combat as a puzzle that needs to be solved. And so he doesn't see it as this, I'm going to do the same thing over and over again because it worked last time. It's, what will work this time? It's hard for me to imagine the way warfare is done today, exactly how that translates over. So if you're looking for lessons, I'm not sure they're there. They might be there, and maybe I just can't bring myself to that point. I think the reason you want to know about Khalid is to know more about humanity. So Arabs are a part of humanity. Knowing Arab history helps inform us of our collective humanity, just like knowing Chinese history or Indian history or English history or Aztec history helps inform us about our humanity. So for me, the question is, how do we as a whole planet understand how we got to where we are? What are the components? What are the pieces? Like, why do so many people speak Arabic? Why is there, from Morocco to Iraq, there's this huge Arab population. Depending on how you measure it, Arabic is either the third or the fourth most widely spoken language on the planet. Although, like with my education, I'd have never known if I didn't go look it up, because it's not taught that way, right? It's almost like there's just this, oh yeah, there's a few people over there and they live in the desert and they're annoying and we can ignore them. But the reality is that it's more complicated than that. If I gave you a compass and a map, and I put you in a boat, and I put you in the ocean, but you don't know which ocean I put you in, you could throw the compass and the map in the ocean because you don't know where you are. It's useless to you. You don't know if you're in the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. You don't know if you're in the southern part or the northern part. I just put you in the ocean. Nothing helps you. You're finished. You pick a direction and hope it's the right one. Make a prayer first. Pick that direction. But if you know where you are, that compass and that map are useful. And that's, I think, what history does for us. It tells us how we got here and who we are, so that at least we have a sense of ourselves. But it's important for me not just know my history for my culture. I need to know everybody's history, at least a little bit, because I want to know how that culture got there and what they're doing and how they struggled and how they suffered. Because we're one planet with one species, one sentient species, although it looks like elephants and killer whales are very smart.
So what got you into that campus and map? Like, how did your interest in Islamic civilization and particularly Khalid ibn Walid started in the first place?
I think I became obsessed with history as a child because, I spent my childhood traveling. My parents were in the oil industry. They met here in Saudi Arabia. They were working for Aramco. My
So your second home here in Saudi already.
If that's true, I am a very happy person.
Well, marhaba, marhaba.
That's too gracious. That would be wonderful. So for me, Saudi Arabia has always had like a mystical space in my heart because it's where my family started. My mother was a nurse. She was part of the vaccination program, but she was working for Aramco. My father was in oil exploration. And so, I think having this childhood where we constantly moved and I interacted with different cultures. I lived in Germany, I lived in England. At one point I was in Lebanon, Algeria, Egypt. I think that made me curious about the world. It was the best education I ever had. But it also made me realize that everybody on the planet has something wonderful and lovely to contribute. Like, there is no culture that's necessarily superior to the next culture. There's no population of people who are doing things right and there's another group doing it wrong. We're all doing it different, and that's actually really magical and wonderful because it means when we encounter problems, there are different solutions. We need to listen to each other. We need to be engaged. And in any case, my obsession with history led me here because one of the things I realized was because I knew enough, I needed to try to unerase people.
What?
Unerase.
Unerase.
So, like Arab history was erased. I was taught Francis Bacon did the scientific method. It was Ibn al-Haytham.
Revive it again, basically.
What?
We want to revive it again,
yeah.
study it again.
We need to. Because, so I didn't hear about Khalid ibn al-Walid until I read that book by Sir John Bagot Glubb Basha. And when I read that book, I went, who is this guy? How come I've heard of Alexander the Great. I've heard of Julius Caesar. I know Napoleon Bonaparte. As a person who loves military history, I need to know about him too. Why is he erased? And it drove me nuts. So for the record, I did that YouTube video because I had been doing a bunch of different political lectures. And I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do next. And so that day I said, you know what, I'm going to do a lecture for me. I don't even care if anybody ever watches it. I'm going to do a fun lecture. And I kind of almost am embarrassed because I should have spent more time fleshing out what I wanted to say. I just got up there and started talking.
That's what I actually gathered from the comments in the YouTube video, that particular one. A lot of people actually surprised of the information you provided. How did you see the reaction of, in the academia and people who are actually interested in history in general when you talk about them, about Khalid ibn Walid, about other, events in history that you're not aware of?
So a few years ago, I was asked to do a talk on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And they gave me 60 minutes. So there's only so much you can do in 60 minutes. And I got up and I did the talk. And everybody that I was giving the talk for was a political scientist. So they were all professors. They were all students of politics. When I was done with the talk, one of them raised their hand and they said, we'd never heard any of that. We didn't know any of that. And then everybody agreed. Well, except for one person. She was a colleague of mine who we were constantly in conversation about Middle East politics. But the rest of the professors there were just amazed because they didn't know this. And I think The reason I'm bringing that up is I think that's also been the response that, Khalid, who's this guy? Where did he even come from? I think our understanding of the Middle East is so small that we don't even know how little we know.
There is quite a few battles in history that we could actually say that they actually changed the course of history.
Yes.
And we know that Khalid bin Walid might commanded some of them.
Yes, he did.
Yes. Well, elaborate on this, if you may.
So, first of all, I don't know if I can tell you how many battles he fought exactly. I think minimally it's like 25, maximum probably around 50. He never was defeated, although one of the first battles that he did is Muta. It's sort of a tie. He managed to extract his men from a situation that he should not have been able to get away from. So if it's 50, then he has 49 wins and 1 draw.
Not bad.
Then it's amazing, right? There's as far as I know, there's only 3 military leaders in human history that fought large number of battles and won every single one, or at least didn't lose any.
Who were the other 2?
Alexander the Great, and he didn't fight anywhere near as many battles as Khalid. And then Thutmose III, the pharaoh of Egypt, he was 18th dynasty. He created an empire. Actually, his stepmother started the empire, and he sort of finished it. And Egypt basically conquered Syria and Palestine, and they conquered Libya. We know he did 17 military campaigns. We know he was undefeated. We don't know how many battles there were per campaign. Could have been 1 battle per campaign, or 5 battles per campaign. So there's no way to have a final number. But in any case, it's those 3. In the case of Khalid, though, there are 2 battles that, first of all, are unimaginable victories. Oftentimes his battle, he'll have 15,000 and he'll be fighting 20,000 Persians. 3 to 4, the odds are against him winning. He pulls it off. It's amazing, but it's not earth-shattering. 2 of his battles are Firaz and Yarmouk. Firaz was right on the border between the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, and when it happened, the Persians and Romans, who hated each other's guts and constantly fighting, got together and said, we have to fight these Arabs together. And they made an army, a combined army of 150,000 men. Awesome. And Khalid had 15,000 men. And you go, that's not
That's almost 10%.
Yeah, it's not possible, it's not doable. And he wins. And that battle, winning that, made it so that the Persians were in such a weak position, they didn't have a chance to recover quickly enough to prevent the empire from eventually being conquered. Right? He doesn't conquer the Persian Empire. He just broke it badly enough that it can't recover in time for subsequent armies to finish them off. And then the Battle of Yarmouk was so catastrophic for the Romans that not only do they not recover, Khalid and Abu Ubaidah will go on to basically finish off Syria and Palestine. Emperor Heraclius is in Antioch the whole time this is happening, and he gets on a ship, and as he gets on the ship, he says, farewell, Syria, you've been a good province to the Roman Empire. May you be a good province to your new masters. Like, he completely surrenders this really valuable piece of territory. The Romans had lost Syria to the Persians multiple times, but in the Roman way of fighting, they would use their navy to take it back. And the fact that the Romans had naval superiority over the Mediterranean made it so it was impossible for the for the Persians to keep Syria. But in this moment, he realizes it's impossible for Rome to keep Syria. And that's such a leap for the Romans, because to them, the world was theirs to conquer, and to be in a position where they're recognizing that, no, this is done, they're in trouble. It must have been a shock.
But how come he came to this conclusion, knowing that Arabs at the time, Muslims, didn't have strong navy?
Well, yeah, they didn't. It isn't until Muawiyah that the Arabs began to build a navy, and they build it so fast that they actually attack Constantinople for the first time. Yeah, so it's amazing that he realizes it. I think it's because of the defeat. The defeat at Yarmouk is shocking. You know, we'll probably never know the exact numbers. The Romans were probably 120,000 to 160,000 in that area. And Khalid's army was 30 to 40,000. So the Romans probably outnumbered the Muslim Arab army 4 to 1. And it shouldn't have, the battle took 6 days. And it should have ended in a Roman victory. And the Romans were so convinced that it was going to end in a Roman victory. I think when they realized that they had been so soundly defeated, it was such a shock, they couldn't imagine recovering from it. And, you know, just a few years earlier, the Persians had taken Syria. They took Syria, they took Anatolia, they took Egypt, they took Palestine, and the Romans recovered and they took it back.
Does that tell us something about how warfare different from today than from the past? I mean, obviously, if you talk about means and such, they're quite different. But if you talk about the motivation or what's drive, you know, campaigns and military campaigns, are they different? And did people go to war today in the past as much as for the same reason that they do for today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are some things that are going to be different. Obviously, Khalid had religious motivation for conducting his campaign, but we've seen other armies have religious motivation. So that's not necessarily unusual. I think one of the things that's interesting about the way the Arab armies operated was they were very gentle with the people they conquered. So there was still violence. I don't want to make it sound like there was, you know, they're taking swords and hacking people to death. But when they would conquer a place, they would then just say, okay, you can convert to Islam or pay tax, and we're going to tolerate you, regardless of your choice. And just the fact that that was the attitude, I think, really dramatically changed the way the conquest took place. The Romans, like if you look at what Julius Caesar did in France, France had Gaul at the time, had 3 million people in it. He killed 1 million conquering the place, which is genocide.
A third of the population.
A third of the population. And then he enslaved 1 million. So when he said welcome to the Roman Republic, he was saying it to 1/3 of the population because 1/3 was being led away in chains. And that's in stark contrast to what Khalid does, right? Where at one point they intentionally gave up Damascus. They captured it, they taxed the people that wanted to not convert. And he said, no, we have to retreat. He turned the taxes back over to the people because he was worried that if he was defeated, the money that they had taxed the people, that money wouldn't go back to them. So it would have been dishonest. It would have been like theft. And so, you know, who does that? Who sits there and says, what if we lose? I don't want to be remembered as a dishonest person. Here's your tax money back. If we win, we'll come back and take it back from you. You know, like...
I'm sure it was something usual to hear at the time. But would you say that was one of the reasons why, you know, these communities were adapted this new coming culture and religion?
I think so. I mean, you know, there isn't a mass conversion event. For the first few decades, Muslims are a tiny minority. There were more Buddhists in the Arab Empire than there were Muslims for the first few decades. You know, Afghanistan, that whole eastern part of the empire was actually heavily Buddhist. So the conquering as a tolerant population, I think, definitely had a positive effect. I only know of one other empire that did something like that, and it was the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great, every time he would conquer you, you instantly got the rights of a citizen, and he made the conquered territories partners of the empire, which is in stark contrast to the Romans, but also the British. The British Empire, they were there to plunder. When the British began conquering India, India accounted for 23% of the world's GDP.
Oh.
When India got its independence, it was 4% of the world's GDP.
That's a massive retreat.
The British Empire took India's economy and transferred it to England. That wasn't what was happening back then. So I think one of the motivations today is you're after resources. But I'm also confused about war today. Like, if you look at the Vietnam War, if the United States had won, what would it have gotten? You could have just not done the Vietnam War and bought whatever it was that you wanted from Vietnam, And that's what we do today. The United States and Vietnam have good trading relations. Ford has factories. Ford Motor Company has factories in Vietnam. You know, like, we could have just skipped the war and built the factories earlier.
And saved tens of thousands of our soldiers.
58,000 American soldiers, 3 million Vietnamese lives. How many billions of dollars wasted? The Afghan war, nobody gained anything from that. The Iraq war, nobody gained anything from that. What Putin's doing in Ukraine, what is he going to get? Is Russia too small? He needed a little bit more land. You know, Russia stretches across 9 time zones. There's 24 on the planet. How many more time zones do you want to go? So I don't understand warfare today. You know, if you do World War II, you go, okay, the Nazis were bad guys. Okay, I get that. That's a good motive to go to war. But you know, the British and American Soviet forces weren't necessarily the best of people either.
Well, let's bring us to something that you mentioned earlier, like the Western civilization is actually moving to China nowadays.
Yeah.
Are you seeing like a change in the warfare in the future? Like the Chinese would be the good or the bad guys, perhaps?
So, you know, I'm just nervous of new empires because new empires have motivations. They're looking after their own. But having said that, I think the Chinese have been playing the game correctly. Their attitude is, we'll come, we'll build infrastructure, we'll build ports, we'll help you with your transportation system, we'll help you generate wealth. And it makes sense because if you go to Kenya and you do this in Kenya, right, and Kenyans have more money, then they have more money to buy your products. And so I feel like the Chinese so far have been gentle enough and they've been savvy enough. Their approach has been, you know, a generally positive approach. But again, I'm always nervous of empires. I don't care who you are, right? Like if I had lived during Khalid's time, I would have still been a little nervous because what are your motivations? It takes time to gain trust. My hope is that the Chinese are gentle with the world because they're a superpower and there's no two ways about it. What I want to see is I want to see a more balanced world where there's multipolar, like the European Union remains a power, that the Arab world becomes more stable and more unified. Like, wouldn't it be great if there was something like the European Union, but for everything from Morocco to Iraq? Sub-Saharan Africa, South America. I would like to see there be sort of these trading blocks where you see a lot more cooperation. And I think that would help reduce the possibility of war going forward.
True. Like if you think about the world of history, like you never see like part of the world that's been, you know, fighting between each other as much as the Europeans. And
it's true.
Yes.
Yeah, the Europeans have done so much warfare against each other, and now they're in this league together. It's amazing. If they can do it, everybody can do it.
It's definitely something they could learn of. There is so many things to say and write about Khalid bin Walid, but as someone who studied him a lot, like what other things you would say about him, Professor?
Okay, yeah. So there's 3 battles that are back to back, and they're actually right before Firaz. And the 3 battles are really strange because they're so unusual, but at the same time, I think they highlight a piece of Arab culture. And they're Zumail, Sani, and Muzayya. And they were basically just 3 watering holes in western Iraq in the desert. And the reason they took place was there was actually 4 Persian units heading towards Khalid's army. And he'd injured one of them already. He sent out a subordinate, Qaqa, to attack it, and they successfully attacked it. So they were basically down to these three units. And what Khalid realized is if the 3 units could converge, they would have about 70,000, maybe 75,000 men against his 15, and he didn't want to face 5-to-1 odds. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to attack them piecemeal. So catch them as 3 25,000 man units instead of 1 75,000 man unit. So he, brought together a council. He's talking to his favorite advisors, listening to what they have to say. And he comes up with the following. He breaks his army into 3 5,000-man units, and he sends them 3 different directions. So he's going to take one, Al-Minhal is going to take another, and Qaqa is going to take the third. And they're supposed to travel to this watering hole, the 3 that I just mentioned. And the idea is they're going to each arrive taking 3 completely different paths at the watering hole at the same time on the same day during the night. Oh. Because he predicts, based on what his scouting had told him, when the Persians will arrive at each watering hole. And they need to go to the watering hole because they're traveling through the desert. So he guesses, okay, I think the Persians will be here, so we need to arrive at this time. And they do it. And they do it 3 times. And they attack the Persians at night, like 2 or 3 a.m. And think about what that would take. You've got 3 forces, 5,000 men each, traveling 3 different directions, arriving at the same point at the same time on the appropriate night. Try it with your friends. Like, get 3 of you with GPS. Cheat. Do it. Go ahead. Take GPS.
Modern warfare.
And try and arrive at the same place with the 3 of you taking 3 different routes. You won't make it. There's no way that you can time it correctly. But he could, and I'll tell you how he did it. The Arabs navigated by the stars. The stars belong to the Arabs. Today, 3/4 of the stars that you can see with the naked eye, without a telescope, have an Arab name. Like, my favorite constellation is the constellation Orion. So the 4 big stars are Bellatrix, which means beautiful leader, so empress, beautiful empress. Betelgeuse, Rigel, and Saiph. Well, Betelgeuse isn't Betelgeuse, it's Ibtal-Jauza. Oh. It's the shoulder of the warrior. Rigel isn't Rigel, it's Rijl. It's the leg of the warrior. And Saiph, because that was the side he had the sword. So even Orion's 3 big stars are still 3/4 Arab named. And the reason why that mattered was that they realized you could figure out by looking at the position of the star in the sky what time of the day it was. And and you could also measure how far you had to travel to get to a location. Because as you changed your position, it would change the angle the star was at. And because Arabia is long enough, you can perceive the change in the star. So in other words, using the stars at night, you could precisely coordinate having your 3 armies land in the same spot at the same time, which I don't think we could do today.
Impressive.
Is it incredible?
It is incredible. And the stars belong to the Arabs. I'm going to quote you in this.
Yeah. I mean, to this day, 3/4 of the names. 600 years before Francis Bacon, Ibn al-Haytham makes a scientific method. He does calculus 600 years before Newton. He states Newton's first law of motion 600 years before Newton. He states Kepler's first law of planetary motion 500 years before Kepler. He identified light as having a finite speed and it traveled in waves, and he invented the lens. And he wrote a book called The Book of Optics. I wake up every morning and I'm thank you, Ibn al-Haytham, as I put my glasses on.
All is that thanks to you, huh? Ibn Haytham.
Yeah, because my quality of my life is so improved by him. And then, subsequently later, people will invent the microscope and bifocals.
Professor, if we see ancient commanders, a lot of their studies and techniques has been studied in our modern history, in corporate even and such. If you see Sun Tzu, Arts of War, a lot of his teachings been, implemented in corporations and such. How would we see Khalid Wali's characters and ideas, and how could we implement it in our modern history, our modern times?
So some of what I would say is interpretation. So it's me looking at Khalid and trying to understand him. And so it's, a little bit of opinion as opposed to I can prove this was actually the case. My understanding of him, because he's hard to get into, he's hard to understand, is that he saw every battle as its own unique puzzle to solve. And when I look at that, I would be in panic mode as the commander. If I do X, what if it turns into a disaster and I'm killed? Forget if I'm killed, my men are killed. That's worse. In other words, he's doing something extremely risky. It's high risk. When you look at what he does, he changes his tactic every time. So he doesn't find the one thing that works and then keep repeating. Although I give you an example of where he does repeat, the 3 night attack events. But usually he doesn't repeat a strategy again. And to do that, in fact, he even contradicts his strategy. So like in Iraq, his goal was to keep the Persians piecemeal, but in Palestine and Syria, his goal was to get the Romans to form one army and fight them all at once. That's what happens at Yarmouk. So he's even flipping the script. He does the unpredictable, like when he crosses the desert from Syria to Iraq, the logical path would have just been to follow the Euphrates. He doesn't, he cuts through the desert. And so everything he does is unexpected. When he looks at the enemy, like at Firaz, he goes, what's their strength? Well, their strength is numbers. They outnumber me 10 to 1. He turns that into a weakness and he uses it against them. There's a battle called the Battle of the Chains. The Persians came with heavy infantry. So he's thinking, I've got light cavalry. I'm against heavy infantry. That's a tough fight. So what can I do to fix it? So what he did was he tricked the Persians into thinking he went to one town, Kazima, when he went to Hufair instead. And when the Persians discover, they start marching to Hufair, but he knows that's what they're going to do. So he runs to Kazima
back.
and then back, right? And his goal is just to keep the Persians moving so that they're exhausted by the time the fight happens. And so the Persians, they go one location, another location, they come back. He's been resting. His men go in there, and he's turned their heavy armor into a weapon against them. And to be able to do that, I think he must have had a few things going for him. For one thing, from what I can tell, he was a very humble person, and I think he listened to his advisors. He had a council of people, Dirar, Qaqa, Al-Minhal, his wife, Layla, was one of his advisors. He had a really close relationship with her, and she was right there with him the whole time they were campaigning. In fact, they have a son together, Muhajir. He's born in the campaign. I think we don't know the exact town he was born in, but it was somewhere around the time that they captured Damascus. And so here's his counsel. He listens to them. Well, a good counsel tells you the things you don't want to hear. A good counsel contradicts your position and argues against you as a commander, because the more information you have, the better the decision you'll make will be. And considering how consistently good his decisions end up being, I can't help but believe he must have had an open counsel. But the other thing that I think must have been going on was his way of looking at the world was a little bit unusual. So when he would look at a battlefield, he'd see the terrain. When he would look at a battlefield, he'd see the enemy and their advantages. When he would look at a battlefield, he would see his troops and their advantages. And he could weigh all that out. That requires out-of-the-box thinking if he's going to change tactics every time. So like when you think of Napoleon Bonaparte figured out some cool strategies like the battalion carré, and he would just keep doing it over and over again, and it usually worked, and he usually won, although he also lost. But Khalid doesn't do that. He is like, okay, yeah, that worked here, but I'm not going to try that. I'm going to try something else. And from my perspective, that's really scary, trying something unusual every time. Like, what are the odds it's going to work? You've never tested this before. It's an untested tactic, and you're going to test it in the battlefield live, and there's no recovery. If he had ever been defeated, that would have been it. The Arabs would not have conquered the Persian Empire or the Roman Empire. He had to run a perfect campaign. And the reason I'm saying all this is because that's one of my fears that I have in the world today. I feel like the way our education systems are set up. And, you know, I don't know enough about the Saudi education. You might be doing something different, but I'm just generalizing. The way it looks to me is the goal is to make everybody kind of think the same way, to sort of be a citizen in the same way, to approach problems the same way. And I don't think he would have thrived in a world like that. I think he would have possibly not graduated from high school just because he thought so out of the box. He was such an unusual thinker. I feel like today our society is give children these boring assignments over and over again and teach them to be good workers but not good thinkers.
Making them copy from other people, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think a lesson that we can learn from him is maybe we shouldn't try to make everybody the same. Maybe we should allow for the unusual thinker, the person who doesn't see the world the same way, to not only thrive but express themselves, because we can learn from the way they see the world. We can experience the world through their eyes, even if we aren't smart enough to do what they do.
I mean, look at us today, like me and you, like discussing the fascinating techniques of Khalid bin Walid 1,400 years ago.
Yeah.
Did people at the time actually appreciated these techniques? Like they started to study it and implement it in a way and help Arabs, Muslims conquering like North Africa, Iberian Peninsula and elsewhere?
Oh, I have no doubt. They must have, because you know, when he's retired in 638, and then he dies 4 years later, the Arabs continue to conquer, and they'll go all the way to Spain. In fact, they'll go into France and they capture the Narbonnais region, and then they'll fight the Battle of Poitiers, and they're defeated, and that's the end of conquest in Europe on that side. And they'll attack Constantinople twice, even before the Ottomans do, but they fail to take it both times because the Romans invented the flamethrower and burnt the Arab navy. But to get even to that point would have required changing the way you approach combat, because the Arabs should not have been able to conquer so much land with such a small population. And so
within very, very limited time frame.
A very limited time frame. It's very quick. It should have been impossible. Having said that, I think there's plenty of evidence that his battle tactics have survived all the way into recent time. There's a really interesting moment in Muta where Khalid is trying to trick the Romans. So what he does is he takes his cavalry unit during the night and he runs the cavalry unit. There's 3,000, he has 3,000 men and the Romans have about 60,000 men. There's 20 to 1. There's no winning that. There's
the difference.
There's a disaster. And so his only goal, because he knows he can't win this, is extract and get the 3,000 home. And so he takes a cavalry unit and he runs it behind a hill. So he's got his army parked up on a hill. There's a valley, and then there's a hill behind. He has the cavalry unit go behind the second hill and then come up over the top so that the Romans can see it, and then come down, at which point he peels the majority off, maybe 90%, and he'll have like the 10% come up the hill with the banner they were holding. And then he has that 90% grab a new banner, go back around the hill, come up over the top, and then drop down, and again, the majority will leave, but then maybe 10% will come up with that banner, and then he'll give them another banner, and he keeps having them do this. So the Romans see thousands of reinforcements arriving, and the Romans are looking at this going, wow, this is a much bigger force than we expected.
The illusion them.
And
It's so much illusion.
It's illusion, and as a result, he does extract the 3,000 men. Well, in the American Civil War, early on, there's a campaign called the Peninsula Campaign. And what happens is General George McClellan, the Yankee general, invades a peninsula very close to Richmond, Virginia, because his thinking is, if I can take out the capital of the Confederacy, they might surrender quickly. Well, Robert E. Lee has a cavalry general named Jeb Stuart. And Jeb Stuart has a problem because there's a Yankee unit, a cavalry unit, chasing him. And he needs to trick them And what does he do? He takes and breaks apart his force, and he has part of his force go up and down this hill with banners to trick the Yankees into thinking he's a much larger force, to slow them down, to make them more cautious. And it works.
Basically, the same technique.
Same technique. And I can't help but wonder, did Jeb Stuart read about Khalid's technique, or did he invent it on his own? For the record, the cavalry general chasing him was his father-in-law.
I see.
So yeah, that must have been awkward.
Another interesting information. But you mentioned earlier something that's caught my attention, which is the wife of Khalid bin Walid. Like, what kind of role she had during his campaign?
So, as far as I can tell, she was one of his top advisors. She was constantly consulting with him. He really trusted her, her wisdom. At the end of the day, he's the general, he's in command, he's going to make the final decision. But that was true for everything, right? Like all his men. And I think everybody understood that he saw the world so differently, they couldn't comprehend what he was doing. I mean, I can't comprehend what he was doing. So they probably very quickly yielded to whatever decision he made. For the record, since we're bringing up Layla, that was his second wife, the wife that traveled with him. His first wife died years earlier. At one point in Syria, just before Yarmouk, there was a woman named Khawla who was not only a soldier and not only fought for his army, she actually formed a women's battalion. And there was a unit of women that actually fought at Yarmouk. In fact, on day 2 and day 3, the Arab army broke both times. And the women that were the support team, not the...
But they were like a combat unit rather than...
This was a combat unit. Yeah, there was a small women's combat unit at Yarmouk. But then the women that were like they would help you if you were wounded or fix your armor, right? The women that were the support women. In day 2 and day 3, when the Arab army broke, they turned and began running away. And the women ran and grabbed the tent posts, and they turned around and they came at the men and they said, "You're our husbands, but you're going to die today. The choice is your wife killed you or a Roman killed you. You pick."
Wow.
And the men decided, "I'd rather be killed by a Roman." And they turned around and they reformed their unit. Twice that happened. And so women played this really powerful role in the victory at Yarmouk. Honestly, if the women hadn't been so active at Yarmouk, I don't know that Khalid would have pulled it off.